Hi, welcome to session 2 of the fifth topic of the semester titled Texas from Nationhood to Statehood, 1836 to 1860. Once again, this is session 2 of the fifth topic of the semester that is dealing with Texas becoming an independent nation, a republic. And we're going to be looking, of course, at those 9 to 10 year period, when Texas was actually an independent country, and the process by which Texas is going to be annexed into the United States as well and become one of the states in the Union, all the way to the eve of the Civil War, 1860. We're going to stop there in this topic. And so far, in session 1, we have been dealing with the formation of the Texas Republic. We covered the formation of the provisional government in 1836 during the struggle for independence from Mexico, and also the Constitution of the Texas Republic, which was very similar to the U.S. Constitution of 1787. There were, almost identical elements present there in terms of the structure, the organization of the government of Texas, and the like, with minor differences, of course. But we see that, again, the ideal state that is created here, particularly by the insurgents, by the revolutionaries that are fighting for independence, most of whom are Americans, of course. They're going to bring their ideas from the United States, their political ideas about classical republicanism, for example, and they're going to recreate it in Texas. Okay, they're going to create a republic. So we examined that quite fully in session 1, and we were dealing also with the first initial years of the republic, in terms of how the first presidential administrations, particularly Sam Houston, who becomes the first elected president of Texas from 1836 to 39, and then his vice president will be elected president from 1839 to 41, Lamar, how they were attempting to forge the nation, how they were attempting to create the independent country of Texas, which was ridden with a number of difficulties ever since the beginning, some of which were financial. Of course, there's the financial aspect of the country. You need to manage the finances, make sure you are going to pay for the bureaucrats, for the administrators. You're going to raise an army, pay also the army as well. That is going to be used to defend the borders of Texas, to maintain order in Texas, deal with the Indian, problem or raidings. Again, the raids of the Indians as well, the Comanches particularly, and other groups as well. So again, there were, of course, financial problems. And of course, economic development is also, an issue. How are you going to develop the economy? What kind of enterprises you're going to develop? You need capital, you need investment. And so there was the problem, again, of obtaining that money if through some form of revenues. Again, we saw that Sam Houston trying to raise revenues and, introducing new taxes on property and the like, on imports, etc. But also inviting, again, colonization, enacting a program by which there's going to be also the possibility for people to come over into Texas with the condition that they can be given land or being sold land, in many cases, with the expectation or condition that they were going to actually develop enterprises again in Texas. So again, we see that there were a number of issues at stake that needed to be resolved. Of course, the political boundaries are established. Okay, the political boundaries of Texas, we cover that. And of course, a new political administration. Okay, So we're going to see that the Mexican political administration is going to be replaced by an American political system. And again, that was part of creating Texas, creating the new nation, something we were looking at again in session one. And of course, we started also looking at Lamar, the vice president, will eventually come into power in 1939, be elected the president, the second president of the Texas Republic. And he's also going to implement a series of policies, some of which contrasted with Houston's policies in order to create the country. They're creating it again. So we were looking at some of the stark differences between Lamar and Houston in terms of Lamar pursuing a more decisive policy to deal with the Indian hostilities. So he prefers to, again, be more determined to deal with the Indian hostilities, expand perhaps the borders into New Mexico, Santa Fe. Again, there's going to be an expedition to kind of expand Texas' sphere of influence into New Mexico as well. And Lamar is not really looking for annexation into the United States. He prefers, again, Texas to remain pretty much independent. So we cover, again, all of that. Now, let's turn to our an outline here so we can proceed then with the Texas Republic, okay, by looking at the Texas economy, the development of a Texas economy, and we're going to be looking also at a society, Texas society as well during the Republic. Once again, we're covering the Republican period. This is when Texas was actually an independent country, a republic. So there was also, again, the need to develop an economy in Texas. You need to invest in the creation of enterprises that are going to serve to generate wealth for the country, and wealth for the citizens of Texas, but also for the state, because ultimately the wealth of the citizens become part of the general wealth, again, of the country at large. So we're going to see the development of particularly three types of enterprises here that were already present in the previous periods we examined, and whether it's the Mexican period or the Spanish period. But we're going to see the expansion of some of those economic activities, and they're going to now become more dominant, okay, in the Texas economy. Okay, so there's going to be an increase in, for example, in the farms, okay? As Americans are arriving, and they have been arriving since the 1820s, by the way, but now they're going to be arriving at greater numbers because there is a colonization program that Sam Houston implemented to invite more colonists to come into Texas, to give them land. Of course, there's going to be now the expansion, the proliferation of farms, of independent farms, small farms, again. So we're going to see hundreds of them, again, expanding across Texas when there's settlement taking place. Again, this is one of the most predominant activities that people engage in because this is the easiest. In many cases, you kind of develop the land to grow your own food and you subsist from the land. So again, the small Texas farm, there are certain characteristics, again, that must be understood, about the small Texas farm in its significance for the economy of Texas, particularly of the people that are coming in and they're trying to pretty much become independent, landowners. They're small landowners. They're not going to have a large enterprise, but this kind of enterprise is going to be a family-run enterprise. This is the enterprise of the family, okay? First and foremost, this is how the family subsists, okay? This is how the family makes sure is going to subsist and also generate perhaps additional wealth as well. Again, so we're not talking about a massive commercial operation here. but it's just enough to sustain a large family, by the way. So what we mean about a family enterprise is that the expectation is that every member of the family has to participate, okay, in this activity, in work in the fields. You have to accompany, for example, you're born into a family of farmers, you have to accompany your parents, your father particularly, along with your other siblings, your brothers, etc., to the fields every day, clear the land, till the land, etc., plant seeds, harvest time, likewise. Again, everybody has to participate, store the grain and the like. So everybody participates in one way or another. It's because this is the family business, okay? It's a family enterprise. And it was not just the small farm in Texas was not just the place where people were just simply growing food, and that was about it. Okay, the small Texas farm was actually a multifaceted economic unit. Okay, so what is multifaceted? That it really comprised many different types of activities, economic activities, into one. It was like a complex. Okay, that was composed of many different sections, if you will. Of course, there's one section, and that is, the section where you actually grow crops. But even that section itself was not just a matter of growing corn, for example, like a single crop, kind of farming activity here, but rather what the Texas farm was trying to do is diversify. Yeah, grow corn, particularly corn, but at the same time include other crops along with it. Okay, you include legumes, like beans, for example. You include also vegetables as well, maybe some wheat, in it as well. This is it's called multi-crop production. And the idea is very simple, is that, well, in the case that one crop fails, for example, wheat, okay, for some reason the weather was not proper this year, etc., okay, it failed. Well, you still have some other crops on the side that you can actually live off of again for that year. You have the corn, the vegetables, etc. You diversify. In other words, it's a multi-crop production. So this is typical of the Texas small farm. Okay, and particularly we're talking about Texas itself here. I'm not really talking about all the other regions in North America. For example, the American states, the U.S. South, etc., might be completely different in this regard. But here in Texas, we're going to see that the small farm actually devoted a section of the land to grow a variety of different, crops. Okay. Just to ensure that there's going to be some food production every year. Okay, so this is very, very characteristic, again, of the small farm. And the other is that in the farm itself, there will also be, again, a section devoted for animal farming as well. Okay, maybe you're gonna, raise goats or sheep or hogs, etc., that are going to supplement the diet of the family. You're going to grow animals for animal protein intake, but also you want to grow animals so you can actually sell them on the market, trade them for other products, etc. Again, you're pretty much generating food. So that's what this enterprise is all about. You're pretty much in the production of food, first and foremost. Okay, so it's also an animal farm. Also, the small Texas farm was a place in which the family members, some of them, those that had certain skills, were also involved in small-scale manufacturing as well. Okay, what we call an artisan. Okay, maybe somebody is very talented in crafting shoes. Okay, like a shoemaker. Okay, so in the farm, there's going to be maybe one of the siblings or one family member that this is what they're going to be doing for the family enterprise. Okay, maybe crafting shoes or hats, etc., clothing attires, etc., maybe blacksmiths. Okay, trying to craft horseshoes or other ironworks, iron tools, and the like, manufacturing. Okay, so it's not just farming per se, but rather there's a multiplicity of different activities here. And because everybody's trying to contribute again to the family economy, so the farm itself is really run like a business, and of course the members are engaged in many types of occupations in order to sustain the business, the family business. But also you're also going to find in the farm itself individuals who were quite skilled at fixing things. Again, we call a jack of all trades. Okay, so whenever somebody needed, for example, somebody to fix an ox cart, okay, or needed somebody to fix a roof, and the like. Again, maybe do some minor construction work and the like. Again, build a warehouse and the like. You probably have to visit a farm, because there you'll find people that were very skilled at that. You'll find at least one person in that family farm that will be able, again, to do all that. In many cases, they did a multiplicity of different things. Again, they were good at many things, maybe construction work, fixing things, whatever needs to be done. Again, they're quite skilled. So this is all another way that in Texas, families, independent families, are subsisting. They're running, of course, the family as a unit. And of course, the farm itself was the enterprise itself, the small Texas farm. Of course, there's a multiplicity. There's hundreds and hundreds, of course, are rising in Texas. Now, another enterprise that is going to develop during the Texas Republic was the plantation. So we mentioned that, very early on. The plantation started arising in Texas when we see the colonization law that Mexico signed for Mexico, allowing the states to proceed to invite colonization into their own states. So we got, of course, Texas opening their doors for American colonization, of course, which led to the emergence of the plantation, because many Americans who came over to Texas during this process were coming from the U.S. South, and they were in many cases landowners, plantation owners that were looking for additional lands to grow cotton, particularly, but also sugar. Again, sugar is not going to be that significant initially, but they're also looking, at lands that they can actually grow and export sugar. It was highly profitable, perhaps even the most profitable crop during this time, alongside with cotton. Okay, so cotton and sugar were the most pricey, the most demanded crops in the world market during this time. So we're going to see, of course, the introduction of the plantation system in Texas. So when Texas becomes independent from Mexico, we're going to see also the expansion of the plantation system along the eastern coast of Texas and the Gulf Coast. Present-day Houston, for example, going all the way to present-day Louisiana. All that section was going to be now developed by American planters that arrived to Texas. They're invited, by the way. They're being given land in many cases to develop enterprises. This is the program that Sam Houston put in place. And we're going to see that this land was very suitable because of the terrain in the soil and because of the hot and humid environment. That is very, very helpful in the production of cotton, particularly. And there will be some sugar, by the way, this initially, again, during the Texas Republic, sugar is not going to be dominant. This is not going to be a crop that was grown, in a significant way. It was actually cotton, okay, the one that is going to be grown and exported. Okay, it will be this is an export-led enterprise. The plantation itself, this is not a family business per se. even though it's run by individuals and certain families. But this is, yes, it is in many cases an individual business, but it's geared towards the external market. It's for export. This is not for domestic consumption. Within Texas, most of the cotton is exported. If not all the cotton, again, that is produced in Texas leaves Texas, okay? Because cotton is actually being processed into clothing in the mills of England, but also in the United States. Again, we're going to talk about that in a separate topic altogether, when we talk about the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution. So we're going to reserve, again, that discussion for later. But there's a great demand for cotton, okay, for textile manufacturing. And Texas is beginning now to export vast quantities of cotton, again, to the industrial nations. This is an industrial revolution taking place. So there's a growing demand for cotton. And Texas is very rapidly developing a cotton-based economy, okay, because it was one of the most important crops that was generated in Texas, that was in high demand overseas, and that really produced vast quantities of monies that were introduced into Texas as a result of those exports. You export products, there's money flowing into the country, that is to say. So during the Texas Republic, towards the latter years, when we look at, for example, 1845, Texas was already exporting 58,000 bales of cotton per year, the equivalent of 14,500 tons per year, again, of cotton. So this is going towards, again, a whole new, era. Texas is now moving into a cotton economy, and cotton will become the dominant crop. In fact, this crop is going to sustain the entire economy of Texas once Texas becomes part of the American Union. Okay, in 1845, Texas was a cotton state, and the entire financial system of Texas was sustained, again, by cotton exports, cotton production. So the plantation system was instrumental in this, because this is the enterprise where cotton is grown. Okay, so this is the enterprise that is in charge of growing the cotton and exporting it. And of course, this is also the system that introduced also the labor system of slavery. Okay, because we cannot talk about plantations without talking about slavery during this period of time. Okay, they're inseparable. Okay, so a plantation can be understood in two ways. Okay, so a plantation is really an agricultural enterprise by which merchants, landowners, investors are growing a cash crop. This is a plant that is a luxury item. Okay, so it's not food like a farm. In farm, people are growing food, producing food to feed a family, to feed, of course, a town, a community, etc. But a plantation, people are not really growing food per se. They're growing something that is a commodity, a plant that is exotic, that is luxurious, and that has a high an aggregate value in the global market. So there's a demand, in other words, outside, somewhere around the world, people are demanding that particular crop, and they're willing to pay gold for it. Okay, it's called cash crop. So again, this is one way we can understand a plantation. It's an agricultural enterprise where people are growing, again, exotic plants like sugar, like tobacco, or in this case, cotton, that is being exported, again, around the world, and is worth cash, is worth gold in this case. But also the other side of the coin is that a plantation can also be seen as a labor system. Again, it's an enterprise that has a specific type of labor system in which the workforce, the labor force, are composed of slaves. Okay, it's very different. Again, here people are not, paid wages. Okay, like in factories, for example. Okay, this is not a wage labor system; it's a slave labor system. Okay, so again, slavery then, with the coming of the plantation in the years of the Texas Republic, is going to become the dominant system of the plantations, and eventually, as we'll see, slavery will become the dominant labor system of the state once Texas joined the Union. Of course, Texas would join the Union as a slave state. So the dominant labor system as a whole, not just within the plantation itself, but virtually everywhere around the state. We're going to cover statehood, in the third session of this topic. Again, slavery will become the dominant, of course, system, not only within the plantation, but virtually everywhere. Okay. So again, so the third enterprise that will become so integral to the Texas economy is, of course, ranching. Ranching is quite ancient, when we talk about Texas history, going back to the Spaniards. So we cover that. Okay. So the Spaniards were the ones that introduced cattle in Texas in the late 1600s. And of course, the missions, the Spanish missions were the ones that kind of, started grazing cattle and developing the first cattle ranches. And after that, we're going to see the development of little rancherias, or little ranches or ranchettes, as they're called, when Spanish settlers are arriving and pretty much seizing cattle that was in the wild and pretty much rounding it up, and of course building their own private enterprise. And we see also the creation of large ranches as well, around San Antonio, Laredo. Very wealthy ranchers are pretty much being given large land grants, and they're grazing hundreds of cattle, etc. So cattle ranching has been central to the Texas economy, going back to the Spanish period and continuing into the Mexican period as well. And now that we have Texas being independent, likewise, ranching will become and will persist to be a dominant, enterprise. It's not going away. It's going to be expanding, by the way, because Americans are settling in Texas, and they see that this is, a prime land for ranching, for raising cattle, and, and of course, driving cattle, to the different towns and markets. Of course, there's going to be a growing demand for beef to sustain the populations. The populations are growing. There's more settlements. There's more towns. There's more people to feed. So this is going to be an enterprise that is going to acquire greater and greater significance, of course. So we are going to see that Americans are moving into this enterprise as well, because there's a commercial opportunity, to be made with the growing populations. You're growing, you're raising cattle, etc. So there's going to be the creation of American-owned cattle ranches that are going to introduce the techniques, the skills, the knowledge of the Americans who are coming particularly from South Carolina. South Carolina, going back to the colonies, to the British colonies, was one of the colonies that excelled, again, in this type of activity, cattle ranching. By the way, one of the leading cattle ranching colonies, again, of all the 13 colonies. And it will persist to be when the United States becomes independent from Great Britain. So here we're going to see that Americans are bringing with them their knowledge, their expertise to Texas, and they're introducing, again, South Carolina traditions, cattle traditions, and cattle ranching, and some of the breeds as well that were dominant in South Carolina will be introduced also in Texas. Also, they introduced sheep into Texas, raising sheep for the wool, again, wool production, but also for meat production as well. Okay. So those are the three most important enterprises. Again, the small farm, Texas farm, family enterprise, and it's very complex to understand it again. But this was a family business, family run, etc. We got the plantation, particularly the cotton plantation, that is becoming dominant in the state because it's producing a crop that it was in great demand around the world, particularly in Europe and in the United States, and it was worth gold. And there was, of course, an intense effort to develop, large cotton plantations in East Texas that were already exporting 14,000 plus tons of cotton per year in the latter years of the Texas Republic. And so, of course, it's going to dominate, if you will, the economy of Texas, cotton agriculture, the plantation system, and also ranching. Okay, so cattle ranching, the expansion of cattle ranches and the like. Now, with that, now let's look at settlements and the urban centers. Okay, because this is going to be also something to look at when we look at the Texas Republic. Is also looking at how we're going to see with increasing numbers of people arriving into Texas and settle and colonize, develop farms and cattle ranches and the like, cotton plantations. We're going to see then the rise of the large urban centers. There's going to be a multiplicity of different towns, small settlements scattered across Texas, of course. But at the same time, we're going to see the development of the large urban centers, the large city, in other words, okay? So I'm not just talking about just small towns, but rather the large urban centers that are going to be significant for really the development of the Texas Republic, because the large urban centers were centers that where people found the large enterprises, for example, or the headquarters of many of the enterprises that were developed in Texas, the main offices, for example, certain cattle ranching industries that were there, or the exports, for example, the shipping industries that were exporting cotton, financial institutions, large businesses, and the like were there. Okay, the large enterprises, the headquarters, the main offices were located in those large urban centers. So this is going to be, again, something that is going to start transforming the society. Again, the presence of those large cities, because this is where the wealth, this is where the political influence is headquartered, is located. Okay, as well. This is the place where you find the large markets. Okay, whenever you wanted to, again, experience, seeing all of the products, that came from all of the regions of Texas where people are trying to sell, etc. Those large urban centers were those types of places. Okay, if you were an artisan, a small manufacturer, if you were a cattle rancher, you will probably go to those large urban centers to sell your product. Okay, maybe once a month, maybe every week, etc. It didn't matter. But this is the place because this is attracting large numbers of people, from different communities, from the neighboring towns, the neighboring settlements. They're flocking to those large urban centers in search of those products. So you'll find those large markets as well. This is also the large urban centers where you find these specializations, again, people that were experts in law, for example, in business, in politics, in manufacturing, and the like. So almost every trade and occupation and expertise, people that specialize on different fields, etc., you'll find them there, okay? Because in many cases, those large urban centers is when, the places where you find, of course, education centers, and this is where you find schools, centers of learning, etc. This is where people are actually getting educated. So again, the cities themselves are places where knowledge is being generated, is being produced, and is being passed on. And one way that this happens is that There's education systems there as well. There's museums where people exhibit their arts again. So this is characteristic again of large urban centers. There's artists, that produce paintings or sculpture, music, and the like, and they pretty much display it again for the public in theaters and the like. Again, this is again very important. However, what is lacking at this time in the Texas Republic is transportation systems. Yeah, we're going to see those large urban centers, it's true, but they're not going to be connected, with a very well developed system of transportation. There's still dirt roads that people must travel, and use. Sometimes they got muddy during rainy seasons, etc. People got stuck for days there in the mud, etc. Again, so we're not going to see transportation technology during this time, despite the fact that there's the rise of large urban centers. Okay, so the large urban centers we're referring here, the largest, I will say, that they're going to become perhaps the largest cities in Texas during this period of time will be the city of Houston. This was initially the capital of Texas, okay, from 1836 to 39. It was named after Sam Houston, by the way, and it was developed, again, particularly ever since 1836 for the purpose of developing a port. Okay, that was one of the central purposes for developing the city of Houston. Okay, it was actually a region covered with swamps. So it was very swampy. There's a lot of swamps, of course. There's a lot of moisture, mosquitoes, and the like. But that was the idea, that this was going to be a very useful, region for building canals. Okay, for the steamships to come into the city of Houston in order to particularly to pick up cotton, okay, for cotton exports. So it was the vision of the future for the city of Houston is this is going to be an ideal region for building an international port, okay? There were already steamships present during this time that were being used for international trade. And of course, we're going to see a system of canals in those swamps I just mentioned. They're going to be carved in a certain way as a form of canals. Houston was just a series of canals initially. Again, when we're looking at this period of time, Houston itself, of course, was just an international port filled with many different canals where the steamships used in order to export the cotton again. And of course, the system of canals was actually named as the Buffalo Bayou. It's still present even today. The bayous are large canals or ditches where the water, particularly when it rains in Houston, the water is channeled away from the city into the ocean, by the way. But previously, during this time, there was just, again, canals that people used to ship cotton. Again, so it was surrounded by hundreds of plantations, the Houston area, all around it. The vast majority are, once again, they're cotton, with few exceptions. There will be few sugar plantations, very few, and also farms. And again, the city of Houston was exporting particularly cotton and foodstuffs, again, to the United States, particularly the United States, but some cotton also left for Europe as well. So again, this is going to lead Houston to become perhaps one of the largest cities in Texas initially because of its location, its strategic location in terms of, again, being situated in the Gulf of Mexico, have direct access to the sea. And of course, there will be now ships coming from many different countries are there, arriving to pick up products again. So it contributed to the development also of the Texas economy, the development of Houston. We're also going to see Galveston, another city that is also arising during the Texas Republic. It was also the purpose of the Galveston city, which was built by a private company, by the way. It was also to use Galveston as an exit point for the export of products and goods produced in Texas as well. International trade is not going to acquire the significance that Houston did, that Houston acquired, but nonetheless, this was also a place that initially was rivaling Houston as a place by which, from which merchants, producers could export their products overseas as well. So we're going to see also the rise of Galveston, that was very near, to located about 45 miles, 50 miles away from Houston. Again, cotton exports will also be, again, the main activity of the city of Houston when it came to exports as well, cotton. Again, we're going to be talking about cotton for quite a while. When we talk about Texas history, cotton is inseparable. When we talk about Texas history, whether we're talking about the Republic or the period when it was a state in the United States, before the Civil War, or even the Civil War itself. Okay. The city of Austin, I mentioned that the city of Austin is also going to be emerging during this time. It's going to be a city that Vice President Lamar wanted to be the capital of Texas, in order to diminish perhaps the influence of Sam Houston, who lived in the city of Houston. He was very much involved in building that city, and this is where his political faction, Sam Houston's supporters and the people that supported him, were actually located in. So what Lamar wanted to transfer, again, the capital from Houston away, and build the city of Austin, develop this city to become the capital. So again, this is something that we're going to see very early on in the very first years of the Republic, the attempt to transfer, again, the capital to Austin. It will remain there ever since, by the way. So those are going to be the three main large urban centers that are going to contain, like I said, the enterprises, the education systems, and the like. Again, the centers for art and the like. Again, the specializations, etc. And they're going to be dominant again in the Texas economy. Now let's look at the Texas society. What was the society of Texas like during the Republic? Okay, we're gonna actually talk about this. Just one second. We're going to talk about the Texas Republic in the context of looking at Texas society as a society that will become very, very diverse, ethnically speaking. Okay, we're going to see the rise of a multi-ethnic society because, as we'll see, there will be several ethnic groups that will come to Texas, settle, develop the land, and become, of course, situated in different regions of Texas. Okay, Texas is going to be settled in different regions by different peoples that come from many different backgrounds. Okay, so we've seen the rise of a multi-ethnic society, and still is today. Okay, by the way, but we see that again, something that is beginning to be very highly visible during the Texas Republic. Not that it was not already multi-ethnic, it was. When you pay attention to the Native American groups, we cover that very early on in the semester. The arrival of the Spaniards, for example. We talked about how during the late colonial period, we're going to see the rise, the emergence of the different mixed groups, like the mestizos, for example, mulattoes and the like. Again, the caste, we talked about that as well. And of course, with the colonization of Texas by Americans, there's another, of course, group that is coming into the region that is adding to the diversity of Texas as well. Okay. But during the Texas Republic, we're going to continue looking at increasing diversity as well. Again, I mentioned just in a minute how diverse already Texas was ethnically, but it will become more diverse still during those 9-10 year period when Texas was, independent. First and foremost, because during this period of time, during the Texas Republic, there will be increasing, of course, increasing immigration from groups arriving from the United States and Europe. Okay, U.S. and European immigration is going to add not only to the diversity, but also to the growth of the population. There will be a demographic growth in Texas. The population of Texas is going to grow to the point that by 1848, there were already 162,000 people living in Texas. Considering, again, that roughly speaking, there were, at the time of independence in 1836, there were 40,000, perhaps 45,000, okay? But now there's going to be 162,000, okay? So this is about 4 times, of what it was initially. In 1836, in a 10-year period. Again, this is going to be an explosion of population. But this explosion of population was due to immigration, particularly from Americans and some European groups, of course, that are arriving. Particularly, the Americans arrive at great numbers. One of the factors, again, it's not the main factor, but one of the factors that bring Americans into Texas is the fact that a great many of them were known to be during this time as quote unquote debtor fugitives. Okay, so what does that mean? That they had pending loans to pay back in the United States, in any of the states, and they were pretty much trying, to free themselves from those financial burdens, trying to free themselves from those, those dues, and they were running away from those dues by moving into Texas. And Texas was an independent country. It was not a territory, by the way, located in the Western territories, in the Western lands, but rather it was an independent country with its own constitution, different laws. So they were seeing Texas as a refuge, if you will, from those obligations, the financial obligations they had back home. So this is one of the factors that is pushing Americans out of the United States to come into Texas. Also, of course, there is the empresario contracts, that we talked about. That Sam Houston is also resorting to the empresario contracts, that the country of Mexico had initiated, awarding land grants to an empresario, again, a colonizing agent, for the purpose of bringing people into Texas. So again, what this led to is that there is going to be increasing number of Americans coming with through those empresario contracts. For example, W.S. Peters received a contract by the Houston's administration to bring in American colonists into Texas to build a colony. It was called the Peters Colony. Okay, most of the immigrant groups of the Peters Colony are coming from the Ohio Valley. Okay, Ohio during this time was going through a commercial revolution. Commercial agriculture is on the rise in Ohio. People are pretty much trying to produce large quantities of products for the market. It was a market economy already, this region, full of commercial farmers, and they're going to bring their capitalist ideas into Texas when they settled Peter's Colony, and they settled in a region around the Dallas area. And so they're going to be the kind of the forerunners of the Dallas region that are going to introduce, again, this idea of free market, free enterprise, capitalism, producing products for the market, etc. They're very market oriented. So this is one of the reasons that, we see that the Dallas-Fort Worth region, even today, is perhaps one of the most highly developed regions that has the largest concentration of wealth and enterprise, etc. There's, businesses, large businesses, big businesses there, etc. Because this was the kind of culture that was introduced by the settlers coming from Ohio. Again, so pretty much brought their own commercial ideas into this region. When they settled, they pretty much transformed the area, started building enterprises and the like. Okay. Also, there was a French entrepreneur, empresario, who received also a land grant to bring people from France, French immigrants. His name was Henry Castro, who built a colony that today is simply known as this region called Castroville. Okay, it was a colony where Castro is going to actually build, is going to develop the land and bring French immigrants, from France again. They're going to be introduced here as well. So we got, again, people from France. There's Americans. There's also French immigrants arriving and building their own French colony, of course, as well. And also there's going to be a German, empresario, who is going to also receive a land grant to build a German colony. Prince Karl of Solms-Braunfels, that was his name. In his commission now to build, of course, a colony where he's going to actually he's going to actually bring immigrants coming from Germany, and he's going to be the one that developed what today is New Braunfels in Fredericksburg. Okay, Fredericksburg and New Braunfels were initially, again, colonies that started out by Prince Karl, in this case, bringing German immigrants. And of course, we're going to see the introduction of a German ethnic group here into Texas, and they're developing farms, for the most part, farming communities. They're producing their own food, etc. But again, this adds to the diversity, again, of the Texas society as well. During this period of time, there are also going to be a different groups arriving into Texas, not necessarily through an empresario contract, like the Peters Colony or the Henry Castro, the French empresario, or the German empresarios, but rather they're just people arriving from many parts of Europe. We're going to see Irish, Scottish, Czech, Swiss, Polish, and there will be some Canadian as well. And also people from England are also going to be arriving into Texas on their own. They're not coming in large groups to build a colony, but rather just to come in order to own their own land and develop the land, begin their own farm, etc. So it's becoming extremely diverse. Texas, that is, because there is, of course, immigration taking place at a great pace. Sorry. But besides the U.S. European immigration, that is adding to the diversity of Texas society, we're also going to see the increasing presence of other groups in Texas. For example, African slaves. I mentioned the plantation, for example, a few moments ago, becoming one of the central enterprises, again, of the Texas Republic. So what we see here is that African slaves are brought by southern planters of the United States in order to serve the purpose of growing the cotton. Particularly, is primarily this is a cotton agriculture that is dominant in the plantations. So they bring with them their own slaves from the United States, from the U.S. South, and we're going to see, of course, the slave population increasing from 5,000 again, and the time of independence in 1836, increasing to 38,000, pretty much towards the end of the Republic, 1844, 1845, there were already 30,000, okay, African slaves in Texas. So the African slave is going to participate in the society in terms of, first and foremost, okay, providing the labor for the plantations, agricultural labor. Okay, so they're arriving to the east coast of Texas because this is where most of the plantations are located. So the strongest presence, once again, of the slave population is in the East Coast, in East Texas. Okay, around the Houston area, for example, moving all the way to the Northeast and bordering already with Louisiana. Okay, all of that region was filled with, plantations, cotton plantations particularly, and they're providing, of course, the labor for growing the cotton, whatever little sugar during this time they're going to be growing as well. They're also going to be used to grow some crops, doing some farm work, and growing additional foodstuffs, etc. This is another responsibility, duty, again, of the Texas slave during this time. Also, they're going to be engaged in what's called household duties. Okay, they work in the household, doing cleaning, for example, gardening, cooking, and the like. Okay, taking care of children and the like. Okay, and also menial jobs. In many cases, the slaves are also quite skilled in different fields like construction work, blacksmiths, for example, building ironworks and the like, fixing, for example, transportation, machinery, etc., like ox cars, for example, so on, putting the horseshoe and the horses and so on and so forth. Again, it was called menial occupations, menial jobs. So it's not just agricultural labor, but they're also engaged in other activities as well outside of the plantation. Okay, slavery will become an institution in Texas when we see the introduction of what is called slave laws. Okay, so once we see that there are laws that clearly state that slavery is legal in any state or in any country. In this case, we're talking about in Texas, in the country of Texas. Once you see, again, the introduction of a constitution or amendments or a series of codes or laws, that indicates that this system of labor is now declared legal, and it becomes also an institution in its own right. Okay, so it's an institution that has a legal right to exist, and there are certain, of course, prescriptions as to what are the responsibilities, the duties of the slaves, etc. For example, in Texas, in the Texas Republic, what we see is that that slaves, according to the slave laws that were introduced during this time, made it very clear that they were first and foremost, a form of property. We talked about that in the beginning of this, this topic. So they're a form of property. So therefore, they cannot be stolen. Okay, because it's like stealing property, and there's going to be punishment for those that steal slaves, for example. If you want to actually, steal a slave, to make them, part of your own property, that is, a crime. That is, people are punished for it. Okay. There's also, of course, people that are going to be punished for aiding or harboring runaway slaves. If you aid a slave to run away, or you pretty much provide shelter, protection, that also deserves, of course, that is declared a crime and deserves a punishment as well. Or if people that incite slave revolts, again, if you are inciting the slaves to revolt, that is also a punishable crime as well. Okay, there's also the issue of runaway slaves. Okay, because that's something that actually occurred, and it occurred quite constantly, not only in the Texas Republic but also in the U.S. South. There's always the issue of slaves escaping, which, by the way, they did escape quite, frequently. Okay, in the U.S. South, they escaped, in great numbers, so much so that by 1830, there were already 500 slaves escaping per year. Okay, in 1830, and on the eve of the Civil War in 1860, there were 1,000 every year escaping. So this is an issue that also Texas is facing during the Republic years. So in many cases, they will flee the plantation and go east. They knew that going east was a safe haven because the Cherokees were stationed there, and they could always just arrive there and be, protected by the Cherokees. They will actually be adopted in many cases by the Cherokee nations there as well. They provided protection to them, but also they fled south. They understood that there was a safe haven also in Mexico. They will move into the San Antonio area, to the city of San Antonio, and from there proceed to keep walking south to the Mexican border, perhaps even going into Mexico as well, because, it was illegal in Mexico to own slaves. It had been declared, illegal, banned. So they were moving into Mexico as well. So we got that issue again, that yes, there's an increase in the slave population, but there's also slaves that are running away, okay, as well. Now, also in Texas, we're going to see, of course, besides the immigrant groups, and the African slaves that are introduced, we're going to see, of course, the Texians, as they were called, okay? The Texians. This is just the population of Texas in general that were already present in many cases before independence, or there were people that had been arriving in very early on in the early years of Texas, the Texas Republic, and that they were very well established already, or they were trying to find room in Texas and trying to accommodate to the society in many ways. So they were simply known as the Texians, in other words, okay, just in very general terms. So how were the Texans like? In other words, how can we assess this population? Okay. So the Texians typically were people that, like I said, the vast majority are coming from the United States. And those were peoples that were really already on the move, moving west and trying to move to the frontier, stay away from the organized states, going into the unorganized territories, going to the western lands in many cases, and trying to find a new life in the frontier. So they brought with them the so-called frontier lifestyle, frontier social worldview. This is a frontier society, that you will find in Texas during this time. What is a frontier society? Well, the people that live in the frontier, people that live outside of the mainstream, again, of the main towns in the United States and the cities and the settlements that were moving into the West. It was considered a Wild West, by the way. So they were kind of like a Wild West type of society, Wild West individuals that were rugged, okay? They were rough, in other words, people that were really rough, because life in the frontier was extremely dangerous, extremely harsh. So in order to adapt to a very harsh, difficult environment full of dangers, full of difficulties, there's, poisonous, insects, there's wolves, for example. There, of course, the hostility sometimes with the Native American groups and the like. And because there's also a lot of outlaws running away from the law. going into the frontier, people develop a certain character, a certain attitude that they become quite tough, very rugged. In other words, very individualistic. They're pretty much on their own. In many cases, they travel by themselves or they travel in groups, but they're on their own. They're making decisions on their own as to where they want to go, if they want to stay with the group, if they want to, go back or move forward, etc. Quite individualistic. They're taking personal responsibility for themselves. They're making personal choices. Okay, it's individualistic. So it's highly individualistic. Again, society in Texas, and they're very coarse. In many cases, they're not necessarily highly educated. So their language, okay, the way their manners, etc., is that they were quite, coarse in terms of cursing a lot, etc. It's quite common, that this was the common way of speaking and communicating, okay, during this time. So again, surviving dangers, the wild animals, there were bandits, again, in many cases. In Texas, it was so common, people stealing cattle, for example, looking for trouble. There were the dangers of the Native Americans. Mexican soldiers as well pose another danger for the Texian as well, because you can always encounter a Mexican soldier that were roaming around, again, all of these lands, Mexico still claiming Texas. And so you're going to also find the difficulty to navigate in this frontier society because it was just full of dangers. Something that is very clear in the Wild West movies, the cowboys movies that we see, again, from Hollywood. That is a lot of myth, in fact, but there's some elements of reality there. There was a tough environment, very individualistic, people looking out for themselves, etc. Okay, disputes were settled, by individuals, in many cases by, engaging in duels. Okay, you see that in those old Western movies, the Wild West. There's an insult, an offense, and people will simply draw their guns and try to settle that dispute right there. No legal issues. We're not going to engage in legal suits, etc. It's very rare that people actually did that back then. It was just settle that dispute right there. There would be a fist fight or a duel, a shooting of some sorts. It was quite common, again, that this was a frontier society in which you will find many people that were so-called outlaws, living outside of the law, for example, living by their own standards or their own laws, for example. And there was, of course, significant consumption of alcohol. Okay, there were many pubs, what we call today a bar. Back then it was like a pub. People drink beer, etc., alcohol, and there will be brawls, fist fights, etc. And the place where they would actually go and find their entertainment, they would gamble, drink, and the like, is the saloon. Okay, the saloon is the kind of the place where people consume alcohol, they gamble. Prostitution was present there as well. Okay, and again, there was a kind of violent environment because individuals were very rugged. They were very tough, and they didn't tolerate, defiance or insults, etc. They will always resort to violence again. So I'm not saying that this is, pervasive, that everybody is this way, but there is something to see, in the Texian population in this regard, that this is how you will find the society. In other words, this is typical, again, of the society, something that will be common to see for the people living in those days. Okay. And also we got, of course, the Native American population, the so-called Indians as they're referred. This is not the proper way, of course, because they're, Native Americans. That would be more proper. But during this time, they were known as simply as the Indians. Again, so this is another group that also inhabited Texas during this time. Not just the immigrants or the African slaves or the Texians, but also the Indians as well. So it's important to just assess the different Native American groups that were present and how their lives are changing as a result of increasing population, increasing immigration. The Indians were already present in this region ever since, thousands and thousands of years ago. We discussed that in the first topic, of course. But the life of the Native Americans, of course, are beginning to change dramatically with the increasing presence. First, the increasing presence of the Spaniards that arrive, very early on, establishing missions and ranches and, the presidios and the like. The Mexican period also intensified the presence, again, of Mexican troops, building more garrisons, and of course, the increasing presence of settlers coming from the United States, colonizing Texas. And now this is going to intensify even further with the increasing presence of more immigrant groups coming from Europe, from the United States, etc. And so we have to assess the life of the Native American in Texas and how they were adapting, changing, etc. So first and foremost, the coastal Indians, they're called the Karankawa tribes. They have been in the coastal region of Texas for thousands of years. They were nomadic. They will travel according to the seasons to the coast. During winter time, they will go to the coast because it was warm. They will fish. They will hunt there. And during summertime, they will go into the mainland as far as San Antonio, for example, and the Rio Grande Valley. They will migrate. Those were migrant groups according to the seasons. That was the lifestyle of those groups. So they had very well established regions where they will hunt and fish, etc. But what we see is the increasing presence of populations that are coming from many different parts of the world, whether it's Europe, the United States, but even people from Mexico. Again, in many cases are moving into the Rio Grande Valley. They're crossing the borders. There will be individuals or a few families that are slowly but surely, again, moving into those lands in the coastal region. So again, the access to those hunting sites is going to be quite limited now because many of the animal wildlife is going to simply flee and leave that region. So they're now, unable to continue the old way of life, okay, of hunting and gathering, etc. So this led then to a problem, again, within those tribes. There are migrants, if you will, in terms of malnutrition. They're not finding, of course, enough food to eat or to hunt or fish. There's also the rise of alcoholism among the Karankawas, and of course, sickness as well. There's an exposure to epidemic disease that is introduced by the different peoples coming into Texas, and that leads to a great reduction of the Karankawa population that by the 1840s, late 1840s, they were already experiencing what is called a near extinction. Okay, they were largely reduced, again, to the point that it was uncertain whether they were going to remain, a distinct, a group among the Native Americans of Texas, because they were, being reduced significantly. We got in the north of Texas, in the northeast, the Caddo tribes. The Caddo tribes that are pretty much descendants from the ancient Mississippians. We discussed that again in the first topic. And so Sam Houston had a policy, an Indian policy that wanted to work with the Native American groups. He wanted to build alliances, in many cases trading alliances, commercial alliances with the Native American groups, because his philosophy was that they could prove very useful in this regard to aid in the economy of Texas. And he wanted to avoid at all costs, problems, conflict, warfare, okay, with Native Americans, because that would simply drain, the finances. So with the Caddos, the civilized tribes of the Northeast, the Caddos, he actually awarded lands along the Brazos River there for them to continue their lifestyle, a place where they will actually ensure the continuity of their tribe. It's called tribal survival and continuity, for the purpose of, again, trying to preserve this society in terms of that society contributing to the economy of Texas. That was his intent. So that's why he was, willing to actually award them lands along the river. Again, he has, of course, a steady supply of water so they can farm, so they can subsist, and their societies can continue. Again, so that was his overall philosophy, again, regarding Native Americans. The Cherokees that were located also in East Texas as well. This is a tribal group that came from the region that today is called Georgia, okay, the state of Georgia. The Cherokees were, again, located there even before the arrival of the Europeans, and gradually they began to migrate westward, okay, as a result of American settlement and the like. And, many Cherokees are moving into places like Texas. There's an incursion of Cherokees into East Texas, and very early on, they negotiate a land treaty with the Mexican government in 1823, and their Cherokees established in East Texas in 1823 when they received a land grant from Mexico. Okay, so they're already building what today we just simply call a reservation, but it was simply a land grant. They're colonizing, parts of East Texas, and a great many of them are going to still come over 10 years later in 1832, when in the United States, Congress passed what is called the Indian Removal Act, that removed about 5 different tribal groups, among them the Cherokees, from the Mississippi basin. Okay, so all of the tribal groups that were in the Mississippi River, in that basin, they will be moved west of the Mississippi as far as, as to what today we call Oklahoma. Okay, they were to be settled in the Oklahoma territory, okay, the Indian Removal Act. And a great many Cherokees came into East Texas because the Mexican government had given land to the Cherokees. And again, in 1832, still, Texas was part of Mexico, so they began to move in here, of course, increasing the number of the Cherokees. But in 1839, when Texas was already independent, it was Lamar was now the president. It was leading Texas, the second president of Texas, of the Texas Republic. Lamar, of course, had a different vision, a different philosophy regarding Indian relationships, that decided to remove the Cherokees from East Texas to go up north and go into the Oklahoma territory. And they were to be moved there because that was the policy, again, of the United States. The Indian Removal Act was to remove the Native Americans so they can actually be moved to Oklahoma, the Oklahoma territory, as it was called. So you got, of course, the Cherokees being removed in 1839 by President Lamar. And of course, this is the situation we're going to see, of course, that, during this period of time, the Cherokees are finding increasing problems in Texas because of this change of policy by President Lamar. And last but not least, the Comanches. Okay, this is another group from the plains of Texas, what is called the Panhandle area. Okay, that for throughout, again, this centuries of colonization by both the Spanish and the Mexican governments trying to colonize and settle Texas. And of course, now the Americans, of course, that are coming into this region and colonizing, they're going to have increasing problems with the Comanches, because for centuries, the Comanches, being nomadic, they're nomads, they're very warlike, they're raiding constantly, the settlements, whether they were Spanish during the colonial period or Mexican, and now, of course, during the Texas Republic, all of the settlements, particularly of the American colonists or the American settlers now, they're going to be raided constantly by the Comanches. And it was very difficult to deal with them because they had no tribal leadership. So they were not really organized into a group of people that had a chief. They were simply bands of people that were acting independent from one another. No tribal leadership. So it was very difficult to negotiate with them, to sit on a table and say, okay, look, let's create a peace treaty here. Let's negotiate and the like, because, we'll benefit, we'll both benefit from a relationship, will be trade, etc. They'll continue to raid the cattle ranches, the settlements, constantly stealing horses. They will steal mules, cattle, for example. And at one point in San Antonio, again, there's going to be a very, very intense, very dramatic encounter between the Comanches and the local population of San Antonio that wanted to pretty much put an end to the Comanche raidings. This was known as the San Antonio Council House Fight, where the some Comanches were invited into the council house of San Antonio to negotiate. They ended up being arrested, by the way. The invitation as well, let's negotiate, etc. There was a ransom to be paid and the like. But as soon as they found out that they were to be arrested, a fight broke out and there was shooting that spilled into the streets. And there were a number of people that ended up being killed, both Comanches and the local population. And this was, of course, now turning into a kind of Indian war, if you will, in San Antonio itself. Okay, so the Comanches were now at war with the Texas Republic. That was clear. This led, of course, to the creation of the Texas Rangers. Of course, Sam Houston had already created the Texas Rangers, and the Texas Rangers are going to be the ones that are going to be at war with the Comanches. Again, they're going to be pursuing them, etc. But it was very difficult, again, this war, because, again, they had no leadership. So there were so many different tribal groups located in different parts of Texas that were fighting simultaneously. So it was a very costly endeavor. This was a very costly war that was draining the finances of Texas. Finally, Sam Houston comes in and puts an end to the Comanche War by creating an Indian commercial alliance with them. He's able to talk to different tribal groups and make peace. And it was very enticing for them, because what Sam Houston is going to do is trade products that they really wanted. Okay, they were looking for horses, they were looking for weaponry, and Sam Houston was willing to give them the weaponry, but in return, for them to actually steal horses and mules from Mexican ranches, again, to the south. Okay, perhaps even into Mexico, to go into Mexico. Of course, relationships between Mexico and Texas were very uneasy. There was a lot of frictions. And what Sam Houston is going to do is make a deal with the Comanches. So the Comanches, their attention will be turned away from Texas and to now raid the ranches, the cattle ranches of Mexico and the border region, to steal the mules, to steal the horses, and to trade them for weaponry. And again, the Comanches are going to make peace, again, with Texas during this period of time. Okay. So last but not least, the Tejanos, of course, this is, again, the Mexican population itself, located particularly in San Antonio, in Laredo. Those were the last group we were seeing in Texas society, the Tejanos, of course. They're, again, in San Antonio and Laredo, who during this time, during the Texas Republic, are going to experience, of course, significant change in terms of being in control of their own towns. They're going to lose autonomy of their own towns because there's a new leadership. Of course, there's new leaders that are taking over now, the city councils and the like of San Antonio and Laredo, and they're going to be losing, of course, autonomy. Some of them are going to even lose property as well. Cattle ranchers are pretty much losing certain lands that are being transferred, given to investors or merchants or colonizers, etc. And of course, this is the situation of the Tejanos, of course. The case of Juan Seguin is indicative of this. One of the wealthiest cattle ranchers of Texas during the Mexican period, by the way, is going to also lose significant property. Again, his cattle ranch will be seized, etc. And he had to flee actually into Mexico itself. He had to leave into Mexico altogether. He had to escape, of course, because he got into problems again with the authorities in San Antonio, and he'll pretty much have to leave Texas altogether. Okay, so of course the Tejanos, the Mexican population, those are the Tejanos here. What they're trying to do is trying to preserve their culture, their heritage in the Texas Republic. They understand that there's a new culture on the rise. Okay, the American culture is now the dominant culture, becoming the mainstream culture of Texas. There's now new laws. There's American, laws, a new constitution, a new political organization, new language, and the like. Even the dominant religion is Protestantism. They're Catholic. So what they're trying to do is simply preserve their heritage as much as possible, along with changing at the same time. It's called continuity with change. They have to learn English. They have to obey, respect American laws. They have to change in that regard, but they don't want to change to the point that they're going to lose their identity, lose, the knowledge of who they are. Okay, lose the memories of their ancestors, their forefathers, going back many generations. They're trying to preserve their traditions, their religion, even their language, if possible, Spanish, but with change, because they understand that, this is a whole new country and they have to simply assimilate and adapt to a whole new reality. Okay. So this is, again, the last social group. With that, we conclude our discussion of Texas society in the Republic. When we come back in session 3, we're going to pay attention to the last 2 portions. Of course, it's going to be annexation and the U.S.-Mexican War. We're going to look at briefly at that, of course, the annexation and the war. And we're going to look at the process of statehood as well, when Texas becomes now an American state, joins the Union, and we're going to pay attention to that when we come back in session 3. That's all I have for you, and we're gonna make a stop here, and return in session 3 to cover once again annexation, the war with the U.S. and Mexican War, and the statehood process as well. Okay, that's all I have for you. Thank you.